Now I want to draw attention to one facet of the SMART learning objective. You may recall that we said learning objectives need to be measurable. There's a tool we can use to better measure each of the learning objectives that we've written for a particular lesson. This tool is called a rubric. Let's talk for a minute about the grading feedback loop in legal education, specifically during the first year. I'm not, nor have I been, a full-time law student, but I did take torts as a 4-credit elective in my PhD program. Now, why would I do such a crazy thing? Well, I wanted to feel the experience of a law student in that learning environment. I wanted to see how the instructional process worked in legal education with my grade on the line. From what I hear, my experience was typical. Throughout the semester, we were given opportunities to participate through a sort of Socratic method and through some small group work, but none of it was graded. And the only feedback I got was oral feedback when I was on call. Unfortunately, I didn't understand what about the exercises was important. Was I any good with my analysis? What were the key elements of the lesson? Was the mental model that I was building correct? How would this relate to whatever my grade was? After all was said and done, I did fine in the class, thanks to long nights of studying. But I couldn't help but let my inner learning scientist creep in. Maybe I could have learned more clearly if I had the expectations for the class laid out, the learning objectives, and the criteria on which I'd be judged for the final test was made known. I could have learned more deeply if I knew how I was performing on the important factors of the class throughout the semester. The feedback that I received after the final was far too late. Had I known what I was going to be evaluated on, my studying could have been more strategic and focused. Further, if I'd known what was important about the exercises I participated in class throughout the semester, formatively, I would have been able to see where my deficiencies as a law student were and work through the semester on fixing them. This is where rubrics come into play. They're not a silver bullet, but they could have helped alleviate some of the stress I, and my classmates, had felt through the semester by giving us comparative performance feedback on tasks throughout the semester. Let's begin by defining a rubric. Rubrics are instructional tools that are used to describe how student performance will be measured and assessed. The student performance can be an exam, a paper, a simulation performance, anything. There's a connection between learning objectives and rubrics. Recall, we previously said that learning outcomes need to be measurable. Rubrics allow teachers to do this measurement by breaking down a learning objective into smaller, more focused, more easily measured pieces called criteria. Criteria are the rows of a rubric. Each row represents a criteria that you've decided is an important piece of the student product that you'd like to measure. Each criteria is judged by a set of levels. The levels establish the columns of the rubric. Levels give you an ability to discriminate between varying levels of performance. That is, what makes each level better or worse than the other. Now, this is one of the strengths of a rubric, being able to tell your relative performance in relation to where you are on the rubric. Many rubrics are broken down categorically, such as poor, average, excellent, or numerically, 0, 1, 2, 3. I've seen equal amounts of both, but if you're using a rubric for grades, numerically is generally how people accomplish that. At the intersection of a criteria and a level is a descriptor. This is a narrative description of what the ideal work product for that criteria and level should represent. They need to be descriptive enough so that you can easily judge whether or not the product meets the requirements of the descriptor. These descriptors should be written in a way that allows you to consistently discriminate between each of the levels. This consistency is very important, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Let's take a minute to talk about how rubrics can benefit your students. There are quite a few, but I'm going to go over 3 or so big reasons you should use a rubric in your class: being explicit, relative feedback, and for teacher efficiency. Perhaps one of the primary strengths of a rubric is to facilitate explicitness. Let's elaborate a little bit on what that means. I was talking to a professor one day, and she likened the first year of law school to being in a room with all the lights off. Students are stumbling around, bumping into each other, into furniture, hurting themselves, and so on. Some students are lucky. They find the light switch, and they find their way out. Other students struggle longer, and sometimes they don't even find the light switch. Think of rubrics as a flashlight to help them see around the room. By using the flashlight, They're making some of what they couldn't see before visible, or explicit. Rubrics can dramatically help your students by informing them about what's essential and important on a given exercise. Essentially, it allows you to communicate your intentions and expectations for the assignment, making them explicit, concrete, and clear. To understand why this explicitness or concreteness is important, let's revisit the differences between novices and experts. If your students are anything like I was during torts, your learners come into class with very little, if any, prior knowledge about any of the first-year topics. They haven't read case law, and they haven't been exposed this in-depth to the legal system. They're essentially novice learners. With novice learners, they have a tendency to form a shallow representation of knowledge. Their study habits tend to be rote, they cram, they try to memorize as much as possible, and unfortunately, they do not connect it with their prior knowledge. What we want our learners to do is be more like experts. Experts have a very well-organized structure of knowledge. They can integrate the incoming information with what they already know. This makes their knowledge structures more robust and more flexible. When knowledge is flexible, they're able to apply it to unique and novel situations. And this is kind of like thinking like a lawyer. So, how do we get novices to be more like experts? According to Goldstone and Son in 2005, novice learners progress better when initially given explicit and concrete information as opposed to abstract and ill-formed information. By creating a rubric, we begin to make explicit, at least initially, our intentions. By having them try to pick it out of our lectures, we're asking them to do something many of them aren't prepared to do. And you might already hear complaints about students not knowing what you want. The message to take away about all this novice-expert talk is that many of our learners are novices, especially early on in their academic careers. By making your performance expectations explicit and concrete, you can set them up for better performance later on in the semester and the year. If we don't tell them what we want on an assignment, how will they know what to do? Provide your learners with rubrics early and often so they can explicitly see what's going on. And this brings us to the second reason to use rubrics. Relative progress. Learners who are given rubrics before an assignment, exam, or skill exercise have an opportunity to constantly compare their current level of understanding with what's expected. Rubrics provide this form of feedback in relation to their current abilities, highlighting where they are strong and not so strong with their work. So rather than a percentage or a letter grade, students can use the criteria, levels, and descriptors to tell them more information about their work. Imagine you've just given a presentation in class, and you'll be giving more of them later in the semester, and your grade depends on you improving fast. Your professor gave you a C. What do you need to do to improve? Was there anything you were good at? Was there anything you weren't so good at? How would you know what to work on? How about if you were given a public speaking rubric that I showed earlier? The professor said you got a 2 on statement of purpose, but a 1 on content organization. By providing a rubric, you're essentially showing them what goes into the letter grade of A, B, C, and so on. The rubric provides them the feedback in the form of a guide. What would it take for them to go from a 1 to a 2? The student can see what the description is to get a 2 on the content organization criteria and focus their efforts on improving in that specific area. Further, as the semester moves along, they can constantly check to see if their work is improving in that area. A student will always know where they stand in the course and know what they need to work on to master the content. And that's important if we want our learners to become more expert. A third benefit to rubrics is that they can make the grading and giving feedback process much more efficient for teachers. It's January, and you still haven't graded your torts finals. You've been up all day for 3 days straight grading papers. You're tired, you're cranky, you need a vacation. Are you grading the students evenly? Did you grade the students this morning the same as you will at midnight the next day? Rubrics can take subjectivity out of the grading. In fact, you can test out the rubric by taking a small handful of work products and asking a colleague to grade them with your rubric. If the rubric can't be applied effectively between subject matter experts, how might it be changed? Finally, rubrics give the teacher feedback on how the students are meeting their criteria. If, in measuring performance on a task or assignment, the students aren't performing very well, then that's a good diagnostic to understand how you can improve your teaching. Additionally, it's good information for other professors to see how groups of students are performing on particular knowledge tasks or skills. This information would be very valuable in communicating how students are progressing through a semester or a year. By using software such as ExamSoft's Rubric tool, you can quickly and easily grade a student's performance and email it to them, removing the need for printed paper and making the entire grading and feedback process much more efficient. The last piece is something that's important to this whole discussion. Rubrics and feedback work together in a few different ways. Not only are rubrics used by professors to rate and grade student performance, but they can also be used to allow students to become more self-sufficient by enabling them to judge the quality of their own work. These valuable judgment skills are also known as metacognitive skills. Metacognition, in essence, is thoughts about one's own thoughts and cognitions. Why is this thinking about thinking important? Students who develop metacognitive skills such as self-regulation, self-assessment, and self-monitoring have been shown to have better learning outcomes than those who do not. When students are given the rubric ahead of time, they have an opportunity to self-assess their work, comparing their current work product to the rubric and developing a more robust understanding of how their work applies to your criteria. Over time, this iterative process can help scaffold metacognitive skills and create better, more effective learners. You might be thinking, how in the world am I going to even start writing a rubric? Well, let me just say that designing an effective rubric does not happen overnight. It's difficult to sit down and crank out an awesome rubric that works perfectly right out of the box. They take time, they take iteration. And to complicate things, there's no one single way. Your rubric really depends on what your goals are. Everyone's different and will approach the creation of their rubric differently. However, I'm hoping to share some information with you that can help you get started. Before you get started with putting a rubric together, it's helpful to think about two major questions. What do I want students to know and be able to do? And how will I know when they know it and can do it well? Answering these questions can also help you narrow down the assessment method that you think will be the best way to see if your outcomes have been met. This first option is probably the easiest. The internet's a wonderful thing, right? There are so many free and open resources out there for teaching and learning, it's not even funny. So, why not do a Google search for rubrics on a topic that you teach? Go ahead, pause the video, and go for it right now. You'll be surprised at how many results pop up. You might find one rubric that does a good job articulating one aspect of your class, and another that does a better job with a different aspect. By combining bits and pieces from other rubrics, you can leverage the work that others have done, and can take some of the most difficult work out of designing a rubric. Now, after you've put together your Frankenstein rubric, test it out. Take last year's exam and look at some of them. Compare the rubric you've put together to the work product created by the students. Does it work? Are you missing some criteria? Are the descriptors worded correctly? This is where the iterative process comes in. The good thing is, you have prior assignments you can use to refine your rubric. Also, don't be afraid to look at rubrics from other domains to help you refine your phrasing. K-12, undergraduate, and some other graduate schools have been doing this for a really long time. There's absolutely no reason we can't look to them for guidance as we build out our rubrics. Let's say you're more daring and you want to start from scratch. How might you get started? First, as we did in the other example, start by looking at some of the previous work of your students. What did they understand? What did they not understand? Did they meet your expectations for that work? This is going to help you craft an initial list of potential criteria. Now, as you're listing out the criteria, think of the depth of knowledge that's associated to that criteria. What does that mean? Well, for example, if one of your criteria is to understand the prima facie elements of battery, when we look at Bloom's taxonomy, that's a little bit on the shallow end of comprehension. Now, some students might actually struggle with this, so you might want to include it. And how about this? Evaluate the facts of the case to understand whether or not a tort actually occurred. The keyword evaluate is a deeper process. Now, if it's early, we can include some of these, but by listing them out, we can make sure that every single criteria doesn't involve a deep process unless we want it that way. It's going to feel a little clumsy at first, but remember, this is your opportunity to make explicit what you intend on teaching. If you're big on issue spotting, then your rubric should reflect that. If you want students to perform a thorough analysis, make sure you have plenty of criteria that communicate good analysis. Okay, so you've taken a stab at writing your own rubric or piecing one together from various sources, but you're afraid to use it because it's incomplete or a work in progress. Don't worry. In this case, something is better than nothing. Sophie Sparrow found that even if you give students an unofficial rubric, it helps them gain some insight and will benefit far more than it will hurt them. Just be sure to let them know that it's a work in progress. The feedback the students give you will also help you tweak and craft your rubric along the way. I couldn't say everything I needed to about rubrics in the amount of time in this video, but I wanted to direct you to an awesome paper on rubrics specifically written for legal education. It's been very influential for me in reconciling the learning science and legal education domains. Sophie Sparrow's Describing the Ball paper is a very, very good place to read more about rubrics in legal education. Heidi Andrade is the author of many papers about rubrics in the educational psychology realm. She also researches formative assessment and metacognitive processes. She's definitely a must-read if you're exploring this area.